Hello, I am Evelyn Evie Hayes, founder and CEO of Havenwood Homes, a nationally recognized real estate developer and sustainable community builder, standing at the podium holding a symbolic gold-plated shovel, preparing to break ground on our largest public housing project ever, a project named Michael's Meadow after my late father. The California morning sun shines down on the vast land where hundreds of new homes will soon be built, bringing hope and a better life to low-income families. Among the radiant faces of city officials, investors, partners, and a large number of local residents attending, my eyes suddenly stopped at a group of people standing in a hidden corner, looking a bit lost and hesitant. They were dressed somewhat old-fashioned, out of date compared to the solemnity of the ceremony. My heart ached slightly. It was Uncle Robert Hayes, my father's eldest brother, and next to him were a few paternal aunts and uncles, people I had not met, or rather did not want to meet, for nearly 30 years. The faces that were once cold, the eyes that were once sharp as knives, the words that were once harsh like salt, rubbed into the wounds of my mother and I after my father suddenly passed away. They had slammed the door of the small wooden house filled with my childhood memories with my father in front of my mother and me, while the pain of loss had not yet subsided. "You two take care of yourselves," Uncle Robert had said, his voice without any pity. "This Hayes house has no place to accommodate parasites' burdens." Now, after nearly 3 decades, when this parasite, this burden, has stood on her own 2 feet, has become a millionaire, a famous philanthropist who is bringing shelter to thousands of others, they have come to us again with forced smiles, eyes trying to appear friendly, and perhaps the 2 words reunion waiting on their lips. Life sometimes likes to play such ironic and cruel plays. My early childhood was a series of peaceful, happy days in a small house in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. My father, Michael Hayes, was a talented carpenter, a gentle, kind man who loved his family very much. He was the youngest son in a large Hayes family, a family known for being well-educated and well-mannered in the area. My mother, Sarah Hayes, was a music teacher, a gentle, beautiful woman with a voice as melodious as a nightingale. Our life, although not rich in material things, was always filled with laughter and love. But then tragedy struck like an unforeseen storm. When I was only 7 years old, my father, while working away from home, unfortunately met with a terrible traffic accident and passed away on the spot. My rosy world collapsed completely. My mother, then in her 30s, collapsed in extreme pain. I was too young to fully understand that great loss. I could only cry with my mother, feeling an emptiness, an invisible fear enveloping our lives. Right after my father's funeral, when the pain had not yet subsided, when my mother and I were still immersed in grief and confusion, the attitude of my paternal relatives, my paternal uncles, paternal aunts who had previously shown love and closeness, changed dramatically, unexpectedly, and cruelly. The reason for that change, I later came to understand, was a combination of many factors. Perhaps it was a calculation of property. The small house my family was living in, although not of great value, was the property left by my grandparents, and my father was the owner. My uncles, especially Uncle Robert Hayes, my father's eldest brother, a patriarchal, pragmatic man who always had the most say in the family, probably wanted to take back that house. Or perhaps they were afraid of taking on more responsibility, afraid of having to take care of and provide for a widow and an orphan like my mother and me. Or perhaps they had already disliked my mother, thinking that my mother, a poor music teacher, was not well matched to the Hayes family, and now when my father passed away, my mother and I were no longer valuable in their eyes. Uncle Robert Hayes, with the consent or silence of the rest of the family, became the mastermind, the one who solved the problem between my mother and me. A week after my father's funeral, he and several other aunts and uncles came to our house. Without a word of encouragement, he coldly announced that my mother and I had to move out of the house within 3 days. "This house was left to me by Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," Uncle Robert said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Michael is gone, and you and your mother have no right to live here anymore. The Hayes family's land cannot be occupied by outsiders." My mother, despite being in pain and broken, tried to beg, "Brother, please have mercy and let us stay here a little longer. I don't know where to go now. Besides, this is also Michael's home, a place with so many memories of him." but Uncle Robert brushed it off. No buts. 3 days. If you and your mother don't move out in 3 days, don't blame us for not respecting our blood ties. Other aunts and uncles stood there looking at her with cold, indifferent eyes. Some even said harsh words. Your husband is gone. You have to take care of your daughter yourself. What else can you expect from this Hayes family? What a burden, you're used to being dependent now. You have no support, you're making others suffer. Hurry up and move out of sight so we can fix up the house, give your children and grandchildren a decent place to live. They didn't let my mother and I bring much, just the most necessary personal belongings. They also tried to keep my father's precious mementos, his favorite things, with the excuse that those are Hayes's things. 3 days later, my mother and I, with a few cloth bags of old clothes and a small amount of money left the house that had once been our home under the cold, contemptuous eyes of those who called themselves relatives. We had nowhere to go, no other relatives nearby to rely on. The following months were the most miserable and humiliating in my mother and I's lives. My mother, from a virtuous wife and a beloved music teacher, suddenly became a widow, penniless, having to raise her young children alone in a strange city where we were forced to move to avoid gossip and the coldness of our relatives. To make ends meet and send me to school, my mother had to do all kinds of hard manual labor. She washed dishes in cheap restaurants, cleaned houses for wealthy families, and worked as a seasonal worker in canning factories. Her soft hands, which once glided over the piano keys, were now calloused and rough from hard work. We had to live in shabby, damp, rented rooms deep in complicated, unsafe neighborhoods. There were days when Mother and I had only a dry loaf of bread to share. There were nights when I curled up under a thin blanket, listening to my mother cry silently in the dark, my heart aching. I had to learn to be independent early on, to help my mother with the chores around the house, to learn how to budget, to learn how to cope with poverty. I witnessed all the hardships, the tears of resentment, and the silent sacrifices of my mother, the pain of abandonment. The feeling of being treated unfairly by my loved ones was deeply engraved in my young mind. I did not understand why they could be so cruel to my mother and me right after my father had just passed away. At first I was very scared, confused, and always wondered if I had done something wrong, if I was a bad child. That's why my relatives hated and chased me away. When I grew up a little, when I understood things better, that fear gradually turned into anger, resentment towards those who were called uncles, aunts, those who had the heart to push my mother and I to the end. But above all those negative emotions is the boundless love I have for my mother. Seeing my mother's sacrifices, her hard work, seeing the wrinkles on her face getting deeper and deeper, I told myself that I must study really well, must be really successful, so that my mother can be happy, so that no one dares to look down on or despise me and my mother anymore. That is the greatest motivation, the highest goal in my life. My mother, Sarah Hayes, was an extraordinary woman. No matter how unfair life had been to her, no matter how much pain she felt from losing her husband, no matter how much resentment she felt from being abandoned by her husband's family, she always tried to get up and live strong for me. She never complained, never told me about her hardships. She always taught me to hold my head high, to live with dignity, and never to surrender to cruel fate. She was the lighthouse that illuminated my life, the endless source of strength that helped me overcome all difficulties and challenges. I threw myself into my studies like a moth to a flame, seeing it as the only way to escape poverty, to change the fate of my mother and I. I was very good at studying, especially subjects related to mathematics, physics, and later architecture and urban planning. I dreamed of one day building beautiful houses with my own hands, civilized neighborhoods, where everyone could live in prosperity, happiness, and equality. During my high school years, I was fortunate to meet Eleanor Vance. Miss Vance was my history teacher, but she was also a very active social worker in the community. She soon recognized my special, difficult circumstances and my hidden talents. She not only helped me mentally, gave me valuable advice, but also quietly introduced me to scholarship programs for poor students who overcome difficulties. And even when I graduated, she gave me a small amount of money from her personal fund to cover the cost of applying to universities. Evie. She took my hand, her eyes filled with affection. You are a strong and intelligent girl. Never let the past get you down. fly high, fly far, and create a bright future for yourself and your mother. With the help and encouragement of Ms. Vance, along with my own tireless efforts, I successfully won a full scholarship to the Faculty of Architecture at Columbia University in New York, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. It was a source of immense pride for my mother and also the first turning point in my life-changing journey. My college years in New York were challenging, but also full of opportunities. I had to study hard to maintain my grades while also working multiple jobs to help my mother cover her expenses and send money back home. My mother decided not to follow me to the city, but to stay in a small town nearby to work. I was always one of the best students in my department with many unique and creative design ideas. During those years, I increasingly realized the pressing problems of modern society, the severe lack of housing for low-income people, the degradation of old residential areas, the lack of connection and humanity in large urban communities. From there, an idea and a great aspiration began to grow in me to build housing areas that were not only beautiful in terms of architecture and convenient in terms of functionality, but also environmentally sustainable, highly connected to the community, and most importantly, affordable so that ordinary workers could own a real home. In a national student architectural design competition, my project of a sustainable urban village won first prize. And it was at that competition that I met Daniel Lee. Daniel is a young, talented architect, graduated from MIT, who shares the same vision and passion for humanistic architecture and sustainable community development as me. We quickly found common ground and decided to start a business together, turning our bold ideas into reality. With a small initial capital, mainly our savings, and a small loan from a startup support fund, we founded Havenwood Homes. Our startup faced countless difficulties, from finding suitable plots of land, applying for complex building permits, raising investment capital, to competing with the big guys in the real estate industry, and convincing the community to believe in a completely new housing model. There were blueprints that Daniel and I had to revise hundreds of times. There were tense, breathless negotiations with government officials and construction contractors. There were days when I had to go directly to the construction site, braving the sun and rain to monitor the progress and quality of the project. But we did not give up. With perseverance, persistence, endless creativity, and a strong belief in our mission, Havenwood Homes' first project, a model social housing complex with smart design, friendly green space, and diverse community facilities, was successful beyond imagination. It not only brought real homes to hundreds of low-income families, but also created a new wave, a new trend in the real estate industry. From that success, Havenwood Homes grew rapidly. We expanded to many cities and states across the United States. We not only build houses but also create civilized and sustainable living communities where people are connected, shared, and respected. And I, Evelyn Evie Hayes, the fatherless girl who was cruelly cast out by her own relatives, became a self-made millionaire, the founder and CEO of a leading real estate corporation, a community builder known and respected throughout America. I not only brought wealth to myself, but also brought home joy and hope to thousands, tens of thousands of others. I bought my mother a beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood where she can enjoy her old age, no longer having to worry about money. I also do not forget my difficult past. I regularly participate in and sponsor charity activities, especially projects to support single women, orphans, and people in difficult circumstances. And now at the groundbreaking ceremony of the Michaels Meadow Social Housing Project, a project named after my late father, a project with profound human meaning, a tribute to the past and a commitment to the future, I had to face them again, Uncle Robert Hayes and my paternal aunts and uncles. Over the years, their lives were no longer as prosperous and glorious as before. Uncle Robert's business, a small mechanical workshop, encountered many difficulties due to competition from large companies and changes in the market, and was at risk of closing down. Their children, cousins whom I only vaguely remember, were also not as successful as they had hoped. Perhaps they also had to face their own events and difficulties. When they heard the news of the extraordinary success of Evelyn Evie Hayes, the forsaken niece of the past, now a wealthy, powerful, and compassionate businesswoman, they probably couldn't sit still any longer. A little shame, a little regret, and perhaps a little hope for some help urged them to come here. After the groundbreaking ceremony ended, while I was busy welcoming the distinguished guests, they tried to approach me. Uncle Robert Hayes, the man who had been the most cruel and mean to my mother and I, was now the first to speak, his voice full of remorse and hesitation. "Evie, my dear." He tried to force a smile. My whole family came here to congratulate you. You are truly a great source of pride for the entire Hayes family. Back then we made such a big mistake. We apologize to you and your mother. Can we ever be together again, my dear? We are blood relatives after all." The other aunts and uncles also stood behind, nodding their heads vigorously, their eyes looking at me with anticipation, and perhaps a little fear. Hearing those words, seeing their miserable, haggard appearance, a complex, indescribable feeling suddenly arose within me. I was stunned for a moment, not because I was surprised by their appearance, but because of their brazenness, their sudden change in attitude. The pain of the past, the image of my mother and I leaving my father's house in tears, the harsh words, the contemptuous looks, all came back as clear as if it were yesterday. But strangely, I no longer felt the anger and resentment like before. There was only a hint of bitterness and sarcasm. And above all, there was a calmness, a self-control of someone who had gone through too many storms, had tempered a heart of stone, but had not lost her kindness. I was no longer the weak, fearful, vulnerable little Evie of nearly 30 years ago. I invited them into a private meeting room in the project's temporary office, away from prying eyes. I wanted this conversation if it happened to be private and candid. I politely invited them to sit down, then silently listened to their apologies and explanations, which were not very convincing. They talked about the difficulties in their current lives, about their belated regrets. They repeatedly mentioned blood ties, family honor, and earnestly wished to be reunited for me to forgive and accept them back. When they had finished speaking, I slowly spoke, my voice calm, but with an undisguised coldness, the weight of years of suffering past. "Uncle Robert, uncles and aunts." I began looking straight into each person's eyes. I still remember clearly. I can never forget the day my mother and I were chased out of my father's house by those who claimed to be our own blood relatives right after he passed away. I still remember clearly the harsh words, the contemptuous looks that you uncles and aunts gave my mother and me that day. "You guys talk about blood ties, about reunion," I continued, a sad smile flashing across my lips. "So where has that blood ties been for the past 30 years when my mother and I have struggled with life, with deprivation, with the pain of abandonment? Is the reunion that you guys want now so late and so easy after all that my mother and I have had to endure alone?" My straightforward, unambiguous words left them completely stunned and speechless. Uncle Robert's face paled, his lips moving without forming words. The other aunts and uncles bowed their heads, not daring to look at me. Shame, guilt, and perhaps despair at realizing their irreparable mistake were clearly visible on their faces. The greatest punishment for them, perhaps, is not my revenge, but my great success today, and the fact that they have to humble themselves to beg for forgiveness, acceptance from the very person they once cruelly rejected and despised. That is a very expensive lesson for their ingratitude, selfishness, and pragmatism. I don't want to prolong this awkward situation. I also don't want to let negative emotions from the past affect the good things I'm trying to build. About the reunion. I shook my head. Blood is something that cannot be denied, uncles and aunts. But the relationship has been damaged too much, the trust has been completely broken. I'm not sure if we can reunite as if nothing had happened. I need time, a lot of time to think about it, and more importantly, I need to ask my mother's opinion. About forgiveness. It's a very complex internal process. I've tried to learn to let go of the hatred and resentment in my heart. I said, my voice softening but still keeping a certain distance. Not for you, my uncles and aunts, but for my own peace of mind. But the scars you left on my mother and me are still there. They can never be erased. Forgiveness doesn't mean I'll forget everything. As for future relationships, I won't completely cut off all ties with you. I said. "After all, you are my father's brothers and sisters. I will maintain a certain level of social relations for my mother's sake, and also for my father's sake, who has passed away. But please respect my private life and don't interfere with my work or decisions anymore. If any of your families are really in trouble, really in need of material help," I paused, looking them straight in the eye, "I will not let the Hayes, the people of my father's blood, live in dire straits if it is within my power, but it will be compassion, the minimum humanity, not complete acceptance or forgiveness of what happened in the past. And that help will also be limited, conditional, and will be done discreetly, not for people to take advantage of or see it as my responsibility." The unexpected and cruel encounter finally ended. The Hayes family left carrying with them mixed emotions, shame, guilt, and perhaps a glimmer of hope for some change in the future. I stood there in the middle of the bustling construction site of the Michaels Meadow project, watching their figures fade away, feeling a strange sense of relief, as if an invisible burden that had been weighing on my soul for so many years had finally been lifted. The past, painful as it was behind me. I had faced, it said, what needed to be said and made my own decisions. I love, respect, and appreciate my mother even more. The extraordinary woman who single-handedly protected, raised, and educated me gave me the strength and faith to overcome everything. I will go home and tell my mother about this encounter, and I believe she will understand and support my decision. I will continue to devote myself to Havenwood Homes, continuing the mission of creating good living communities, real homes for people in difficult circumstances. I will establish a charity in the name of my father, Michael Hayes, to support strong, single women like my mother and unfortunate orphans, so that they do not have to experience the pain and deprivation that I have experienced. They once chased my mother and I out of the house, but it was that abandonment, those difficulties and challenges, that gave me the strength and will to rise up to build a home, not only for myself, not only for my mother, but also for thousands, tens of thousands of others. The reunion that they wanted will probably never be as complete as before, but the peace in my soul, the happiness of living a meaningful life, that is the most important thing, the true legacy that I want to leave behind. When relatives who once heartlessly chased you and your mother out of the house at the most miserable time, pushing you into years of hardship, now come back to bow their heads and beg for reunion and forgiveness, when you have become rich and successful, can there be any real reconciliation? Is Evelyn Evie Hayes' decision a reasonable balance between reason, emotion, self-respect, and a little necessary humanity? What would you do if you were in Evie's situation? Especially when you have a mother who has suffered so much by your side, share your thoughts and feelings about this story.